A single word carved into a wooden post. No bodies, no signs of struggle. No explanation for where 115 men, women, and children had vanished without a trace. In 1590, when English ships returned to Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina, they found only empty houses, scattered belongings, and one of history's most enduring mysteries, the complete disappearance of America's first English colony. But here's what will shock you. The mystery of Roanoke runs far deeper than a simple case of missing colonists. We're talking about a story that involves international espionage, indigenous resistance, failed dreams of New World riches, and a cover-up that may have hidden the truth for over 400 years. The disappearance that has puzzled historians for centuries might not be a mystery at all. It might be the result of deliberate actions by people who had very good reasons to make sure the truth never came to light. Welcome to History Unleashed, where we dig beneath the surface of history's greatest mysteries to uncover the truth that's been hiding in plain sight. I'm your host, and today we're investigating one of America's oldest and most haunting unsolved cases, the lost colony of Roanoke. From the ambitious dreams of Sir Walter Raleigh to the harsh realities of colonial survival, from Native American politics to Spanish imperial strategy, we'll explore every theory and examine every clue to solve a mystery that has captivated America for over 4 centuries. If you're ready to finally learn what really happened to those 115 lost souls, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're about to reveal evidence that could rewrite American history and solve one of the greatest mysteries of the colonial era. Trust me, by the end of this investigation, you'll never look at the story of early America the same way again. So prepare yourself for a journey back to 1587, when hope and desperation collided on a remote island that would become the graveyard of dreams and the birthplace of America's greatest mystery. The story of Roanoke begins not with the colonists who would disappear, but with the ambitious dreams of one of England's most charismatic and controversial figures, Sir Walter Raleigh, whose vision of an English empire in America would set in motion a chain of events that would end in mystery and tragedy. Raleigh's obsession with establishing an English foothold in the New World was driven by a complex mixture of patriotic ambition, personal greed, and romantic notions about America that bore little resemblance to the harsh realities that awaited European settlers on the North American coast. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted Raleigh an extraordinary charter that gave him virtually unlimited authority to explore, colonize, and exploit any lands in America not already claimed by Christian princes and a document that essentially made him the proprietor of most of the North American continent, and granted him powers that rivaled those of medieval kings. This charter was not merely a business license but an instrument of national policy, as Elizabeth sought to challenge Spanish dominance in the Americas, while also finding new sources of wealth that could finance England's growing military and naval expenses. Raleigh's choice of Roanoke Island as the site for England's first permanent American colony reflected both strategic thinking and fundamental misunderstanding of New World realities. The island's location in the Outer Banks of present-day North Carolina offered several apparent advantages. It was far enough south to avoid the harsh winters that had destroyed earlier northern settlements. It provided access to both ocean and inland waterways that could facilitate trade and exploration, and it was positioned to serve as a base for privateering operations against Spanish shipping lanes that carried American gold and silver back to Europe. However, Raleigh's understanding of Roanoke was based on superficial reconnaissance and wishful thinking, rather than careful study of the environmental and cultural challenges that would confront English settlers. The island's sandy soil was poorly suited to European agricultural techniques. Its location exposed settlers to both Atlantic storms and attack from Spanish naval forces, and its position placed the colonists directly in the middle of complex political relationships between Native American groups who had their own interests and agendas that did not necessarily include cooperation with European interlopers. That the recruitment of colonists for Raleigh's venture revealed the fundamental contradictions and unrealistic expectations that would doom the enterprise from the beginning. Raleigh promised potential settlers that America offered unlimited opportunities for wealth and advancement, painting pictures of a land where gold could be found lying on beaches, where fertile soil produced crops without labor, and where Native Americans would eagerly trade valuable commodities for European trinkets. These promotional materials attracted people who were unprepared for the actual challenges of colonial life and whose expectations of quick wealth made them unsuitable for the patient work of building sustainable communities. The composition of Raleigh's colonial expeditions also reflected serious misunderstandings about what kinds of people and skills would be necessary for successful colonization. The early Roanoke expeditions included too many gentlemen adventurers seeking quick profits and too few farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who possessed the practical skills necessary for survival in unfamiliar environments. The inclusion of women and children in later expeditions, while indicating more serious intentions about permanent settlement, also increased the vulnerability of colonial communities that lacked the resources and security necessary to protect non-combatant populations. The financial structure of Raleigh's colonial venture created additional pressures that worked against successful colonization and contributed to decisions that prioritized short-term gains over long-term survival. Investors expected quick returns on their colonial investments, leading to emphasis on finding gold, discovering valuable trade goods, and establishing profitable relationships with Native American groups, rather than focusing on the agricultural development and community building that would be necessary for permanent settlement. The political context of Raleigh's American ambitions also created complications that would affect every aspect of the colonial enterprise. England and Spain were moving toward open warfare during the 1580s, making any English colonial activities in America potential targets for Spanish military action, while also limiting the resources that the English government could dedicate to supporting colonial ventures. The complex European diplomatic situation meant that Raleigh's colonists would be operating in a war zone where their survival might depend as much on international politics as on their ability to grow food and maintain peaceful relations with their Native American neighbors. Here's something that reveals how personal ambition and national policy can create impossible situations for ordinary people. From which country are you watching this? Because colonial history around the world is full of examples where grand imperial dreams led to disasters for the settlers who were sent to implement those dreams. What examples can you think of from your region's history where colonial ambitions created tragic consequences for the people involved? Share your insights in the comments. The cultural arrogance that characterized English attitudes toward Native Americans during this period created additional obstacles to successful colonization that Raleigh and his associates failed to anticipate or understand. English colonial planning assumed that Native American groups would welcome European settlement and readily adopt European customs, technologies, and religious beliefs while also providing labor, food, and military support for colonial communities. These assumptions ignored the complex political, economic, and cultural systems that Native American societies had developed over centuries and failed to recognize that indigenous peoples might have their own reasons for resisting or rejecting European colonization. The environmental challenges facing English colonists in America were similarly underestimated by Raleigh's planning. As promotional literature emphasized the mild climate and natural abundance of the American coast while downplaying the hurricanes, droughts, diseases, and seasonal variations that could devastate unprepared European communities. The assumption that English agricultural techniques and food crops would thrive in American conditions proved disastrously wrong, as colonists discovered that their familiar farming methods were inadequate for American soils and climate patterns. The logistical challenges of maintaining supply lines between England and America also proved far more difficult and expensive than Raleigh's initial planning had anticipated. The costs of shipping food, tools, and other essential supplies across the Atlantic were enormous, while the dangers of ocean travel, warfare, and shipwreck meant that relief expeditions might be delayed or lost entirely. Colonial communities that depended on regular supply shipments from England were therefore extremely vulnerable to disruption of these supply lines, while the financial burden of maintaining these shipments eventually became unsustainable. For even wealthy investors like Raleigh, the military threats facing English colonies in America included not only potential Spanish attacks, but also the possibility of conflicts with Native American groups who might view English settlement as a threat to their own territorial and political interests. Raleigh's colonists were inadequately prepared for military action and lacked the numbers, training and equipment necessary to defend themselves against determined enemies, while their isolated location made it impossible to receive quick assistance from other English settlements or military forces. The initial English attempt to establish a colony on Roanoke Island in 1585 revealed the fundamental flaws in Raleigh's colonial vision and set in motion the chain of events that would lead to one of history's greatest mysteries. This first expedition, led by Ralph Lane and consisting of over 100 men, was conceived primarily as a military and reconnaissance operation, rather than a genuine attempt at permanent settlement, reflecting the English understanding of colonization as conquest and exploitation, rather than community building and agricultural development. Ralph Lane, a career military officer with experience in Irish campaigns, brought to Roanoke the same brutal tactics that the English had used to suppress Irish resistance, viewing Native American populations as obstacles to be overcome, rather than potential allies whose cooperation would be essential for colonial survival. Lane's military background made him effective at organizing defensive positions and maintaining discipline among his men, but also predisposed him toward confrontational approaches that would poison relationships with indigenous communities whose support the colonists desperately needed. The composition of Lane's expedition reflected Raleigh's misconceptions about what would be required for successful American colonization, as the group included numerous gentleman adventurers seeking quick wealth, soldiers expecting to fight Spanish forces, and craftsmen hoping to discover valuable minerals, but very few farmers or other specialists in food production who would be essential for long-term survival. This imbalance meant that the colonists were dependent from the beginning on trade with Native American groups for food supplies, creating a relationship of dependency that would become increasingly problematic as cultural misunderstandings and conflicts developed. The initial contact between Lane's colonists and the indigenous peoples of the Roanoke area appeared promising, as Native American leaders welcomed the English newcomers and provided crucial assistance with food, shelter, and information about local conditions. However, these early positive relationships were based on mutual misunderstandings about intentions and expectations that would quickly deteriorate once both sides realized that their goals and assumptions were fundamentally incompatible. The Native American groups in the Roanoke area, primarily the CROATOAN and related Algonquian-speaking peoples, had their own complex political and economic systems that the English colonists neither understood nor respected. These societies were organized around seasonal movements between different resource areas, sophisticated agricultural systems that maximized productivity in coastal environments, and extensive trade networks that connected communities across hundreds of miles. The English assumption that Native Americans would simply provide food and labor for colonial enterprises ignored these existing systems and failed to recognize that indigenous peoples had their own economic needs and political priorities. The breakdown of relations between Lane's colonists and their Native American neighbors followed a pattern that would be repeated throughout the colonial period, as English demands for food and assistance exceeded what indigenous communities could provide without compromising their own survival. While English refusal to respect Native American political authority and territorial rights created escalating conflicts that ultimately made cooperation impossible. The incident that finally destroyed any possibility of peaceful coexistence occurred when Lane ordered the execution of Wingana, the principal chief of the CROATOAN Confederation, based on suspicions that the chief was organizing resistance to English demands for food and tribute. This assassination, carried out through treachery during a supposed peace conference, demonstrated the English willingness to use violence against Native American leaders while also eliminating the one indigenous authority figure who might have been able to negotiate sustainable relationships between the two groups. The military conflict that followed Wingana's murder made Lane's position on Roanoke Island impossible to maintain, as the colonists found themselves surrounded by hostile Native American forces, while also running dangerously low on food supplies that they had expected to obtain through trade. The English military advantages of firearms and metal weapons proved insufficient to overcome the indigenous advantages of local knowledge, larger numbers, and familiarity with coastal warfare, tactics that neutralized many European technological advantages. The psychological impact of isolation and conflict on Lane's colonists reveals important insights into the mental health challenges that faced early European settlers in America, as men who had expected quick wealth and easy victory found themselves trapped in a hostile environment where survival required skills and knowledge they did not possess. Contemporary accounts describe increasing paranoia, depression, and desperation among the colonists as their situation deteriorated and the possibility of rescue or escape became increasingly remote. Here's something that shows how quickly situations can spiral out of control when cultures clash and misunderstandings multiply. From which country are you watching this? Because colonial history worldwide is filled with examples of first contacts that began peacefully, but deteriorated into violence due to mutual incomprehension and competing interests. What examples can you think of from your region where cultural misunderstandings led to tragic consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments. The arrival of Sir Francis Drake's fleet at Roanoke Island in June 1586 provided Lane's desperate colonists with an unexpected opportunity for evacuation, as Drake offered to transport the entire colony back to England after his successful raid on Spanish Caribbean settlements. The decision to abandon Roanoke represented not just military retreat, but acknowledgement that the English approach to American colonization had failed catastrophically, leaving behind a legacy of violence and mistrust that would complicate all future English settlement efforts in the region. The hasty evacuation of Lane's colony resulted in the abandonment of substantial supplies, equipment, and structures that the colonists had built during their year on Roanoke Island, creating an eerie precedent for the more famous disappearance that would occur just a few years later. The speed of the departure also meant that Lane's men were unable to leave any clear messages or signs about their intentions, creating the first mystery about what had happened to English colonists on Roanoke Island. The intelligence gathered by Lane's expedition about Native American political organization, military capabilities, and territorial boundaries provided valuable information for future English colonial planning. But this knowledge was interpreted through the lens of military conquest rather than peaceful coexistence, leading to strategies that emphasized fortification and armed force rather than diplomatic negotiation and mutual accommodation. The environmental observations made by members of Lane's expedition, particularly the detailed drawings and descriptions produced by John White and Thomas Harriot, provided Europeans with their first accurate information about American ecosystems, indigenous agricultural techniques, and the seasonal cycles that governed life in coastal North Carolina. However, these scientific contributions were overshadowed by the military and political failures that characterized the expedition's overall impact. The economic results of Lane's colonial venture were disastrous for Raleigh's American investment, as the expedition not only failed to discover any sources of immediate wealth, but also consumed enormous resources without producing any return on investment. The financial losses associated with the first Roanoke expedition created pressure for future colonial ventures to achieve quick profits, contributing to unrealistic expectations and inadequate preparation that would continue to plague English colonization efforts. The propaganda war that followed Lane's return to England involved competing narratives about what had gone wrong at Roanoke and who was responsible for the colony's failure, as Raleigh and his supporters sought to maintain political and financial support for future American ventures, while critics argued that the entire colonial enterprise was misguided and wasteful. These competing accounts of the first Roanoke colony created confusion and disagreement that persisted for centuries and contributed to the mythologization of English colonial experiences in America. The second and most famous attempt to establish an English colony on Roanoke Island began in 1587 with high hopes and careful planning that seemed to address the failures of Lane's earlier expedition, but ended in complete mystery that has puzzled historians and captivated the public imagination for over 4 centuries. This expedition, led by John White and including 115 colonists, among them 17 women and 9 children, represented a fundamentally different approach to English colonization that emphasized permanent settlement, family life, and peaceful coexistence with Native American neighbors rather than military conquest and quick exploitation of natural resources. John White's background as an artist and ethnographer rather than a military officer suggested that this colonial venture would be more sensitive to indigenous cultures and more committed to sustainable development than Ralph Lane's aggressive expedition had been. White had participated in Lane's colony as the expedition's official artist and had produced detailed drawings of Native American life, customs, and political organization that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding indigenous societies rather than simply conquering them. His appointment as governor of the new colony suggested that Raleigh had learned important lessons from the failures of the first attempt and was committed to pursuing more diplomatic approaches to colonial development. The composition of White's colonial expedition reflected serious intentions about creating a permanent English presence in America, as the inclusion of entire families indicated that these colonists were not expecting to return quickly to England with easy profits, but were prepared to invest their lives and futures in building a sustainable community in the New World. The presence of women and children also suggested that the colonists understood the need to establish agricultural and domestic systems that could support normal family life rather than the military camp atmosphere that had characterized Lane's venture. The initial challenges facing White's colony were substantial but not insurmountable, as the colonists had to rebuild structures that had been abandoned during the hasty evacuation of Lane's expedition, while also establishing new relationships with Native American groups that had been alienated by the violence and treachery of the previous English occupation. The discovery that the fortifications and houses left behind by Lane's men had been partially destroyed suggested that local indigenous peoples remained hostile to English presence, but also indicated that they had not completely obliterated evidence of European occupation, leaving open possibilities for future diplomatic reconciliation. The decision to settle on Roanoke Island rather than seeking a completely new location reflected both practical constraints and strategic miscalculation, as White's colonists lacked the resources and time necessary to explore alternative sites while also failing to appreciate the degree to which their presence on Roanoke would be viewed as a continuation of Lane's aggressive policies rather than a genuinely new beginning. The island's previous association with English violence and cultural insensitivity created a burden of historical grievance that made peaceful coexistence much more difficult to achieve. The early months of White's colony appeared to progress reasonably well, as the colonists succeeded in repairing damaged structures, planting crops, and establishing basic community institutions without facing immediate military attacks from hostile Native American forces. However, beneath this surface stability lay serious problems that were not immediately apparent, but would eventually prove fatal to the entire enterprise. The birth of Virginia. Dare, on August 18, 1587, the first English child born in America, represented both the hopes and vulnerabilities of White's colonial project, as the successful delivery of a healthy baby demonstrated that English families could survive and reproduce in American environments while also highlighting the colony's dependence on continued peace and prosperity for the survival of its most vulnerable members. Virginia's birth became a symbol of English colonial aspirations, while also emphasizing the stakes involved in colonial success or failure. The supply crisis that developed during the colony's first months revealed fundamental problems with Raleigh's logistical planning and financial support for the venture, as the colonists discovered that their food supplies were insufficient to last through the winter, while also lacking the tools, seeds, and other essential materials necessary for successful agricultural development. The realization that immediate supply from England would be essential for colonial survival created pressure for Governor White to return to England to organize relief expeditions rather than remaining with his colonists to provide leadership during critical early months. Here's something that reveals how quickly hope can turn to desperation in colonial ventures. From which country are you watching this? Because the pattern we see at Roanoke, initial optimism followed by supply crises and logistical failures, was repeated in colonial attempts worldwide. What examples can you think of from your region's colonial history where similar supply problems led to disaster? Share your insights in the comments. John White's fateful decision to sail back to England in late 1587 to organize supply expeditions created the circumstances that would lead to the colony's mysterious disappearance, as his departure left the colonists without their designated leader during the crucial period, when they would need to establish sustainable relationships with local indigenous groups while also developing agricultural and economic systems that could support their community through multiple seasonal cycles. White's absence also meant that no European witness would be present to document the events that led to the colony's disappearance. The arrangements made between White and his colonists before his departure included specific protocols for communication and emergency procedures that were designed to ensure that relief expeditions would be able to locate the colony even if circumstances forced the colonists to relocate from Roanoke Island. These agreements included plans for leaving written messages indicating new locations, carving signs on trees to provide directions, and maintaining signal fires that could guide rescue ships to colonial settlements. The careful nature of these preparations suggests that both White and his colonists understood the risks involved in his departure and attempted to minimize the dangers through systematic planning. The international political situation that developed during White's absence in England created obstacles to organizing relief expeditions that neither White nor Raleigh had anticipated. As the escalating conflict between England and Spain culminated in the Spanish Armada campaign of 1588 that required all available English ships and personnel for national defense rather than colonial support, the transformation of what should have been a routine supply expedition into an impossibility due to international warfare demonstrates how global political events could determine the fate of small colonial communities that had no influence over or knowledge of the larger forces affecting their survival. The attempts by White to organize private relief expeditions during 1588 and 1589 were frustrated by a combination of financial constraints, shipping shortages, and official government policies that prioritized military needs over colonial support, leaving White increasingly desperate as months passed without any communication from his colonists, while he remained unable to organize effective assistance for their potentially deteriorating situation. The psychological toll on White of knowing that his daughter, granddaughter, and friends were potentially facing starvation or attack while he remained helpless to assist them provides insight into the personal costs of colonial ventures for families and individuals who became separated by vast distances and unpredictable circumstances. The privateering expedition that White eventually joined in 1590 as his only means of returning to America represented a compromise with circumstances that reflected both his desperation to reach his colonists and the limited options available for transatlantic travel during wartime conditions. The decision to participate in a profit-seeking privateering voyage rather than organizing a mission specifically designed to assist the colony created additional complications that would affect White's ability to conduct thorough search operations once he finally reached American waters. When John White finally returned to Roanoke Island on August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years after his granddaughter Virginia Dare had been born, he found a scene that would become one of history's most haunting mysteries. The settlement that had housed 115 hopeful colonists was completely abandoned, with no signs of recent habitation, no bodies, no evidence of violence, and no clear indication of what had happened to the men, women, and children who had trusted their lives to this remote colonial venture. The physical evidence that White discovered on Roanoke Island told a story of careful departure rather than sudden catastrophe, as the colonists' houses had been taken down in an orderly fashion, and their belongings had been removed or carefully stored rather than scattered by violence or panic. This organized evacuation suggested that the colonists had time to plan their departure and were not fleeing from immediate danger when they left the island, contradicting theories that they had been massacred or had died from disease or starvation. The famous word CROATOAN, carved into a post of the fort, represented the most significant clue that White found about his colonists' fate, as this word referred to both a Native American group and their home island, now known as Hatteras Island, about 50 miles south of Roanoke. According to the prearranged signals that White had established with his colonists before his departure, this carving indicated that they had relocated to CROATOAN Island and were in no immediate distress, as they had not included the Maltese cross that would have signified emergency or forced removal. The absence of the distress signal gave White hope that his colonists were safe and had simply moved to a location where they could receive better support from friendly Native Americans. But his attempts to reach CROATOAN Island were frustrated by severe weather conditions and the unwillingness of his ship's crew to risk their vessel in the treacherous waters around the Outer Banks. The combination of approaching storms and the privateering expedition's commercial priorities meant that White was forced to abandon his search just when he had discovered the most promising lead about his colonists' whereabouts. White's emotional account of his final departure from American waters reveals the personal anguish of a man who knew he would never see his family again and blamed himself for the circumstances that had separated him from his daughter and granddaughter during their hour of greatest need. His description of watching the American coastline disappear over the horizon, while knowing that his loved ones were somewhere beyond his reach, provides one of the most poignant moments in early American colonial literature. The failure of White's 1590 expedition to locate the missing colonists marked the end of systematic English efforts to solve the Roanoke mystery during the colonial period, as Raleigh's resources were exhausted and his attention was diverted to other ventures, while the English government showed little interest in investigating the fate of a small group of colonists whose disappearance had no obvious strategic or economic implications. The abandonment of the search efforts ensured that whatever had happened to the lost colony would remain mysterious and subject to speculation rather than definitive historical documentation. The initial theories about what had happened to the Roanoke colonists reflected contemporary English assumptions about colonial life and Native American behavior, with most explanations focusing on the possibility that the colonists had been killed by hostile indigenous groups or had died from disease, starvation, or environmental disasters that were common threats to European settlements in America. These early theories generally assumed that the colonists were victims of circumstances beyond their control, rather than active agents who had made conscious decisions about their survival strategies. The Spanish interest in the fate of the Roanoke colonists added an international dimension to the mystery, as Spanish officials conducted their own investigations into what had happened to the English settlement, while also spreading rumors that they had captured and executed English colonists who posed threats to Spanish territorial claims in America. The Spanish accounts of Roanoke's fate were often contradictory and politically motivated, making it difficult to determine how much accurate information they possessed about the colonists' actual experiences. Here's something that shows how mysteries can persist when there's no immediate political or economic incentive to solve them. From which country are you watching this? Because every region has examples of historical events that remained mysterious, partly because the people in power had no pressing need to investigate them thoroughly. What unsolved mysteries from your area might have been solved if there had been more motivation to find answers? Share your thoughts in the comments. The transformation of the Roanoke mystery from contemporary concern to historical curiosity occurred gradually as the focus of English colonial efforts shifted to other regions, and the original participants in the Roanoke ventures died without leaving comprehensive records of their experiences and observations. The passage of time made it increasingly difficult to separate fact from speculation about what had happened to the colonists, while also allowing romantic and dramatic interpretations to compete with more prosaic explanations. The archaeological evidence from Roanoke Island has provided some insights into colonial life during the brief period of English occupation, but has failed to resolve the fundamental questions about what happened to the missing colonists, or where they went when they left the island. Excavations have uncovered foundations of colonial buildings, fragments of European artifacts, and evidence of interaction between English colonists and Native American groups, but nothing that definitively explains the colonists' disappearance or ultimate fate. The environmental factors that may have contributed to the colony's abandonment include severe drought conditions that occurred during the late 1580s and may have made agriculture impossible for both English colonists and their Native American neighbors, creating food shortages that could have forced all groups in the region to relocate or seek alternative survival strategies. Tree ring analysis and other paleoclimatic evidence suggest that the Roanoke area experienced some of the worst drought conditions in centuries during the period when the colonists disappeared. The role of intertribal warfare among Native American groups in the Roanoke region may also have contributed to the colonists' decision to abandon their settlement, as conflicts between different indigenous factions could have made the island unsafe for non-combatant European families, while also disrupting the trade relationships that the colonists depended upon for food and other essential supplies. The complexity of Native American political relationships in the region meant that English colonists could easily become unwitting participants in conflicts they did not understand. The possibility that the Roanoke colonists made conscious decisions to integrate with Native American communities, rather than waiting for uncertain rescue from England, challenges traditional narratives that portray them as helpless victims of circumstance, suggesting instead that they may have adapted successfully to American conditions by adopting indigenous survival strategies and social relationships that ensured their continuation as individuals, even if their English colonial identity was lost in the process. The legacy of John White's failed search for his colonists established patterns of speculation and investigation that would continue for centuries, as each generation of Americans would develop new theories about what had happened to the lost colony, while also using the mystery as a vehicle for exploring broader questions about cultural identity, survival, and the relationship between European and Native American societies in early America. The mystery of what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke has generated countless theories and investigations over the past 4 centuries, ranging from careful historical analysis to wild speculation, with each generation of researchers bringing new perspectives and methodologies to bear on questions that have never been definitively answered. The persistence of public fascination with the Roanoke mystery reflects not only the compelling nature of the disappearance itself, but also the way that different theories about the colonists' fate have served as vehicles for exploring broader questions about American history, cultural identity, and the relationship between European and Native American societies. The integration theory, which suggests that the Roanoke colonists joined with friendly Native American communities and were gradually absorbed into indigenous societies through intermarriage and cultural adaptation, represents one of the most plausible explanations for their disappearance and has gained increasing support from historians and anthropologists who recognize that such integration was a common survival strategy for isolated European settlers throughout the colonial period. This theory is supported by the CROATOAN message that John White found carved at the abandoned settlement, as well as by later reports from English colonists at Jamestown who heard accounts of Europeans living among Native American groups in the region. The relocation theory proposes that the Roanoke colonists moved inland to establish a new settlement in a more secure location with better access to fresh water, fertile soil, and friendly Native American allies, but subsequently died from disease, conflict, or environmental disasters before they could be located by English search parties. This explanation accounts for the orderly abandonment of the Roanoke settlement, while also explaining why no trace of the colonists was found in later investigations, as their remains and artifacts would be scattered across unfamiliar territories that were never systematically searched. The massacre theory, which dominated early explanations of the colonists' fate, suggested that hostile Native American groups had killed all the English settlers in revenge for Ralph Lane's earlier violence, or in response to Spanish encouragement to eliminate English presence in the region. However, this theory has been largely discredited by the lack of physical evidence for violence at the Roanoke site, the orderly nature of the settlement's abandonment, and the absence of the distress signal that the colonists had agreed to leave if they were under attack. The Spanish capture theory emerged from colonial-era reports that Spanish forces had located and eliminated the English colonists as part of their efforts to prevent rival European powers from establishing permanent settlements in territories claimed by Spain. Some Spanish documents from the period mention the capture or killing of English colonists, but these accounts are often vague, contradictory, or politically motivated, making it difficult to determine whether they refer to the actual Roanoke settlers or to other English presence in the region. Archaeological investigations of Roanoke Island and surrounding areas have provided valuable insights into colonial life during the brief period of English occupation, but have failed to resolve the fundamental mystery of what happened to the missing colonists. Excavations led by researchers from the University of North Carolina and other institutions have uncovered foundations of colonial buildings, artifacts from both English and Native American sources, and evidence of interaction between different cultural groups, but nothing that definitively explains the colonists' disappearance. The development of new archaeological techniques and technologies has opened new possibilities for investigating the Roanoke mystery, as ground-penetrating radar, advanced dating methods, and DNA analysis of human remains provide tools that were unavailable to earlier researchers. These modern investigative methods have identified several promising sites for further exploration, while also ruling out some locations that had previously been considered potential destinations for the missing colonists. Recent archaeological work on Hatteras Island, the former CROATOAN island mentioned in John White's carving, has uncovered evidence of European presence during the late 16th century, including metal artifacts and pottery fragments that could have belonged to the Roanoke colonists. However, the evidence remains circumstantial, as similar artifacts could have reached the island through trade or other forms of contact between Native American and European groups. The genetic studies conducted among modern Native American populations in eastern North Carolina have searched for DNA markers that might indicate European ancestry dating to the colonial period, with some researchers claiming to have found evidence of mixed European and Native American heritage that could be traced to the lost colony period. However, these genetic studies face significant methodological challenges, as European DNA could have been introduced to Native American populations through many different historical processes over several centuries. Here's something that shows how modern technology can both help and complicate historical investigations. From which country are you watching this? Because advances in archaeology and genetic analysis have revolutionized historical research worldwide, sometimes confirming old theories and sometimes creating new puzzles. What examples can you think of from your region where modern scientific techniques have changed our understanding of historical events? Share your insights in the comments. The documentary evidence from the early Jamestown colony includes several tantalizing references to Europeans living among Native American groups in the Virginia and Carolina regions, with some accounts specifically mentioning fair-haired people or individuals wearing European clothing who might have been descendants of the Roanoke colonists. However, these reports were often recorded decades after the supposed encounters and may reflect wishful thinking or cultural assumptions, rather than accurate observations. The role of drought and environmental stress in the colonists' disappearance has received increasing attention from researchers who have used tree ring analysis and other paleoclimatic evidence to reconstruct weather conditions during the late 1580s and early 1590s. This research suggests that the Roanoke region experienced severe drought conditions during the period when the colonists vanished, which could have made agriculture impossible and forced both English settlers and Native American groups to relocate in search of better water sources and growing conditions. The political dimensions of Roanoke research have sometimes influenced the development and promotion of different theories about the colonists' fate, as various groups have used the mystery to support particular narratives about American history, cultural identity, and the relationship between European and Native American societies. Some theories have been promoted more for their romantic appeal or political implications than for their historical plausibility, creating additional confusion about what actually happened to the missing settlers. The international context of the Roanoke disappearance, including the ongoing conflict between England and Spain, and the complex political relationships among different Native American groups, suggest that the colonists' fate may have been influenced by forces and events that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances on Roanoke Island. The colonists may have become unwitting participants in conflicts they did not understand, or they may have been affected by political and military developments that occurred far from their settlement. The oral traditions preserved by Native American communities in eastern North Carolina include some accounts that could relate to the fate of the Roanoke colonists, with stories about Europeans who joined indigenous communities and were gradually integrated into Native American society. However, these oral histories must be interpreted carefully, as they may have been influenced by later historical events or by contact with other European groups, making it difficult to determine which elements might specifically relate to the lost colony. The continuing mystery of Roanoke has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and archaeological expeditions that have contributed to public awareness of early American history, while also generating new theories and interpretations that may or may not be historically accurate. The popular fascination with the lost colony has sometimes led to sensationalized or speculative accounts that prioritize dramatic storytelling over careful historical analysis, creating additional challenges for researchers attempting to separate fact from fiction. The transformation of the Roanoke mystery from historical curiosity to active archaeological investigation has been driven by advances in technology, methodology, and historical understanding that have created new possibilities for solving one of America's oldest unsolved cases. Modern researchers combine traditional historical analysis with cutting-edge scientific techniques to search for evidence that previous generations of investigators could never have detected, while also bringing new perspectives to the interpretation of existing evidence about the colonists' fate. The First Colony Foundation, established in 2005 as a collaborative effort between academic institutions, archaeological organizations, and local communities, has coordinated systematic investigation of multiple sites across eastern North Carolina that could potentially be connected to the lost colony. This interdisciplinary approach combines historical research, archaeological excavation, environmental analysis, and community engagement to create comprehensive understanding of the cultural and natural context that shaped colonial experiences in the region. The use of ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies has revolutionized the search for Roanoke-related archaeological sites by allowing researchers to identify buried structures and artifacts without the time, expense, and potential damage associated with large-scale excavation. These non-invasive techniques have revealed previously unknown colonial period structures and activity areas while also helping to prioritize locations for more intensive investigation. Archaeological excavations at Site X on Hatteras Island have uncovered compelling evidence of European presence during the late 16th century, including copper artifacts, iron tools, and ceramic fragments that could have belonged to the Roanoke colonists or to other Europeans who were in contact with Native American communities during the colonial period. The dating and cultural analysis of these artifacts continues to provide new insights into the timing and nature of European Native American interaction in the region. The discovery of the Dare Stone in 1937 claimed to provide definitive evidence about the fate of the Roanoke colonists through a carved message, supposedly left by Eleanor Dare, describing the deaths of her fellow settlers and her own survival among Native American communities. However, subsequent investigation revealed that this artifact was almost certainly a modern forgery, created to capitalize on public fascination with the lost colony mystery, demonstrating the need for rigorous authentication. Procedures in Roanoke research. DNA analysis of human remains found at various sites in eastern North Carolina has been used to search for genetic evidence that might connect modern populations to the missing Roanoke colonists, with some studies claiming to have identified European genetic markers among Native American communities that could date to the colonial period. However, these genetic studies face significant methodological challenges, as European DNA could have been introduced through many different historical processes over several centuries. The development of more sophisticated dating techniques has improved researchers' ability to establish chronologies for archaeological sites and artifacts that might be connected to the Roanoke colony, allowing more precise determination of whether particular evidence actually dates to the period when the colonists disappeared, rather than to later periods of European Native American contact. Environmental archaeology has provided new insights into the ecological and climatic conditions that the Roanoke colonists would have encountered, including evidence for severe drought that could have made agricultural survival impossible and forced both English settlers and Native American groups to relocate in search of better growing conditions. This environmental context helps explain why the colonists might have abandoned Roanoke Island even in the absence of military threats or disasters. Here's something that demonstrates how persistence and new technology can sometimes solve very old mysteries. From which country are you watching this? Because archaeological breakthroughs around the world have shown that even centuries-old questions can sometimes be answered when new methods are applied to old problems. What examples can you think of from your region where modern techniques have solved historical mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments. The collaborative approach that characterizes modern Roanoke research involves partnerships between academic researchers, government agencies, tribal communities, and local historical organizations that bring different perspectives and resources to bear on the investigation. This interdisciplinary cooperation has been essential for gaining access to research sites, obtaining necessary permits, and ensuring that investigation proceeds with appropriate respect for cultural sensitivities and community interests. Public archaeology programs associated with Roanoke research have created opportunities for community members and volunteers to participate directly in archaeological excavation and analysis, providing valuable assistance to professional researchers while also educating the public about archaeological methods and historical interpretation. These programs have helped build local support for Roanoke research, while also training new generations of amateur archaeologists and historians. The use of historical GIS, geographic information systems technology has allowed researchers to create detailed maps showing the locations of known archaeological sites, historical landmarks, and environmental features that might be relevant to understanding the colonists' movements and activities. These digital mapping tools help identify patterns and relationships that might not be apparent from traditional historical analysis, while also facilitating collaboration between researchers working in different locations. Underwater archaeology has explored the waters around Roanoke Island and the Outer Banks for evidence of shipwrecks or other maritime artifacts that might be connected to the lost colony, including the ships that transported the colonists to America and the vessels that John White used in his attempts to locate his missing settlers. While no definitive Roanoke-related shipwrecks have been identified, these investigations have contributed valuable information about maritime activity in the region during the colonial period. The re-examination of historical documents using new analytical techniques has sometimes revealed previously overlooked information about the Roanoke colony and the broader context of English colonial activities in the region. Advanced imaging techniques can make faded or damaged text more legible, while computer-assisted analysis can identify patterns and connections in large collections of documents that might not be apparent to human readers. The international dimension of modern Roanoke research includes collaboration with scholars and institutions in England, Spain, and other countries that possess historical documents or archaeological collections relevant to understanding the colonial period. These international partnerships have provided access to archival materials and artifacts that were previously unavailable to American researchers, while also bringing new perspectives to the interpretation of familiar evidence. The digital preservation and dissemination of Roanoke research results through online databases, virtual museum exhibitions, and interactive websites has made archaeological discoveries and historical analysis available to global audiences, while also facilitating collaboration between researchers who might not otherwise have access to each other's work. These digital resources have transformed Roanoke research from a specialized academic pursuit into a public endeavor that engages the interest and participation of people around the world. The continuing development of new technologies and methodologies ensures that the search for the lost colony will continue to evolve and potentially produce new discoveries, as techniques that do not yet exist may eventually provide the evidence necessary to solve this centuries-old mystery. The persistence of scholarly and public interest in the Roanoke colony guarantees that future generations of researchers will continue to apply whatever new tools and perspectives become available to this enduring puzzle of American history. The persistence of the Roanoke colony mystery after more than 4 centuries of investigation reveals fundamental truths about how historical knowledge is constructed, preserved, and transmitted across generations, while also demonstrating the enduring human fascination with unsolved puzzles that touch on themes of survival, identity, and the relationship between different cultures. The lost colony has become more than a historical event. It has evolved into a cultural phenomenon that serves as a lens through which Americans and others explore questions about colonialism, cultural identity, and the complex interactions between European and Native American societies that shape the development of the new world. At the transformation of the Roanoke mystery from contemporary crisis to historical legend illustrates how the passage of time can change the significance and meaning of past events, as what began as a practical problem requiring immediate solution has become a source of romantic speculation and national mythology that serves purposes very different from those that motivated the original colonial enterprise. The colonists who disappeared in the late 16th century could never have imagined that their fate would continue to captivate public attention centuries after their deaths, or that their story would become a symbol of American origins and the challenges of cross-cultural encounter. The multiple theories about what happened to the Roanoke colonists reflect different assumptions and values about American history, cultural identity, and the relationship between European and Native American societies that have changed significantly over time. Early theories that emphasized massacre or catastrophic death reflected colonial-era fears and prejudices about indigenous peoples, while more recent theories about integration and cultural adaptation reflect contemporary values that emphasize multicultural cooperation and the agency of historical actors in shaping their own destinies. The archaeological and historical research that continues to investigate the Roanoke mystery demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of modern scientific methods for solving historical puzzles, as new technologies and techniques can reveal evidence that was invisible to previous generations of researchers, while also creating new questions and uncertainties that may never be definitively resolved. The application of cutting-edge science to historical investigation has transformed our understanding of colonial period life and culture, but has not yet provided the definitive answers about the colonists' fate that many researchers and members of the public continue to seek. The cultural impact of the Roanoke mystery extends far beyond academic historical research to encompass literature, popular culture, tourism, and local identity formation that have made the Lost Colony an integral part of how Americans understand their national origins and cultural heritage. The mystery has inspired countless books, plays, movies, and television programs that have shaped public perceptions of early American history while also creating economic opportunities for communities in eastern North Carolina that have built tourism industries around their connection to the Lost Colony story. The educational value of the Roanoke mystery lies not only in its specific historical content, but also in its demonstration of how historical knowledge is constructed, how evidence is interpreted, and how different theoretical frameworks can lead to different conclusions about the same set of facts. The study of the Lost Colony provides students and general audiences with opportunities to engage with primary sources, evaluate competing theories, and understand the challenges that historians face in attempting to reconstruct past events from incomplete and sometimes contradictory evidence. The ethical dimensions of Roanoke research have become increasingly important as scholars and communities have developed greater awareness of the need to respect Native American cultural heritage and to avoid perpetuating colonial-era assumptions about indigenous peoples that may be reflected in traditional approaches to studying the Lost Colony. Modern research increasingly emphasizes collaboration with tribal communities and recognition of indigenous perspectives on the colonial encounter, while also acknowledging that Native American oral traditions and cultural knowledge may contain important information about historical events that was not recorded in European documents. Here's something that reveals how historical mysteries can become more significant over time than the original events themselves. From which country are you watching this? Because every culture has unsolved historical puzzles that have taken on symbolic importance beyond their original significance. What examples can you think of from your region where historical mysteries have become part of cultural identity or national mythology? Share your thoughts in the comments about how these stories continue to influence contemporary culture. The technological future of Roanoke research holds promise for new discoveries and insights, as emerging scientific techniques provide unprecedented capabilities for detecting, analyzing, and interpreting archaeological evidence from the colonial period. Advances in DNA analysis, environmental reconstruction, digital archaeology, and other fields may eventually provide the evidence necessary to solve aspects of the mystery that have remained elusive despite centuries of investigation, while also revealing new questions and complexities that previous researchers could never have imagined. The international dimensions of the Roanoke story connect this American mystery to broader patterns of European colonization, intercultural contact, and imperial competition that shaped the early modern world and continue to influence contemporary global relationships. The fate of the Roanoke colonists was influenced by events and decisions made in London, Madrid, and indigenous communities across eastern North America, demonstrating how local events can only be understood within broader historical contexts that transcend national and cultural boundaries. The psychological appeal of the Roanoke mystery reflects fundamental human needs for closure, meaning, and understanding that make unsolved puzzles particularly compelling and memorable. The combination of real historical significance, human drama, and unresolved questions creates a narrative that satisfies our desire for engaging stories while also challenging our intellectual capabilities and persistence in the face of uncertainty and incomplete information. The preservation of historical sites associated with the Roanoke Colony has become an important priority for cultural heritage organizations and government agencies that recognize the educational and symbolic value of these locations for understanding American origins and colonial period history. The protection and interpretation of these sites ensure that future generations will have opportunities to engage with the physical landscape where these historical events occurred, while also supporting continued research that may eventually provide new insights into the colonists' experiences and fate. The ultimate lesson of the Roanoke mystery may be that some historical questions cannot be definitively answered with available evidence, but that the search for answers can be as valuable as the answers themselves in terms of what it teaches us about historical methodology, cultural understanding, and the complex relationships between different societies and time periods. The Lost Colony continues to challenge researchers and capture public imagination, not because it provides easy answers, but because it poses difficult questions that illuminate fundamental aspects of human experience and historical change. The legacy of the Roanoke colonists lives on not only in the mystery of their disappearance, but in their representation of the hopes, fears, and challenges that have characterized human migration and cultural encounter throughout history, making their story relevant to contemporary discussions about immigration, cultural adaptation, and the ongoing challenges of building inclusive societies that respect both continuity and change in an increasingly interconnected world. As we step back from the windswept shores of Roanoke Island and the centuries-long search for answers to one of America's greatest mysteries, we're left with a story that is both frustratingly incomplete and remarkably revealing about the nature of historical truth, human ambition, and the complex encounters between cultures that shaped the New World. We've discovered that the lost colony of Roanoke was far more than a simple case of missing persons. It was the culmination of imperial dreams and cultural misunderstandings, of careful planning and catastrophic miscalculation, of human hopes and harsh realities that collided on a remote island where the margin for error was virtually non-existent. The 115 men, women, and children who vanished into history were not just statistics in a colonial experiment gone wrong, but individuals with names, families, and dreams who found themselves caught between worlds in ways that their English backgrounds had never prepared them to navigate. The enduring mystery of what happened to these colonists tells us as much about ourselves and our relationship with the past as it does about 16th century colonial life. Each generation has approached the Roanoke puzzle with its own assumptions, technologies, and cultural perspectives, seeing in the empty settlement and the carved word CROATOAN reflections of their own fears and hopes about American identity, cultural encounter, and survival in an uncertain world. Perhaps the most profound lesson of Roanoke is that the greatest mysteries often arise not from supernatural forces or inexplicable events, but from the very human tendency to venture beyond our knowledge and capabilities in pursuit of dreams that may be impossible to achieve. The colonists who disappeared were not victims of alien abduction or supernatural intervention, but of the gap between European ambitions and American realities, a gap that claimed countless lives during the colonial period. If you've been captivated by this journey into America's oldest unsolved mystery, make sure you're subscribed to History Unleashed and hit that notification bell, because we're committed to bringing you more investigations into the stories